Welcome to Miles of Music. I'm Bob Miles. We are on part 2 of the incredible life of Dennis Sandole. I am joined here with some of the top musicians in the world that were long-term students of Dennis. First is Scott McGill. Hi, Scott.
How you doing, Bob?
Craig Thomas.
Hello, Bob.
Fred Weiss.
Hi, Bob.
Bobby Zankel. And Joe Federico. Joe, tell us a story about this footstool about Dennis. Let's talk about Dennis as a person this segment.
All right, it's the footstool story. When I first started taking lessons with Dennis, it was in the late 50s. When you went into the studio, you went up the stairs into a room, and in the room, just a square room, there was the couch where Dennis sat, there was a piano, and then in the middle of the room was a pretty rickety chair, a rickety music stand, and that footstool. So whoever went into that studio at that time sat in that chair and probably put their foot on that footstool. So that footstool had a lot of famous feet on it. And so James Moody probably put his foot on there when he sat in that chair. John Coltrane maybe put his foot on there. None of you fellows were there at the time, so none of your feet were on that stool. But somewhere along the line, as Dennis moved from studio to studio, the stool went with him. Then somewhere along the line, it got lost. About 2 or 3 years ago, a friend of mine that had helped Dennis through one of the moves came over to my house. He says, "I have a present for you." And he just took it out and handed it to me. And I said, "That's the footstool from the old studio." So that's what we're looking at, the famous footstool.
That's great.
That's amazing. Well, who else studied off of Dennis that you mentioned earlier to me?
Randy Brecker. Let's give me some help, fellas.
James Moody.
James Moody.
John Coltrane. Art Farmer.
Wow.
Yeah. I could mention some names. I'd have to give a little background on some of the players because the people today might not know them. Billy Root was a saxophonist in Philadelphia, a fine jazz saxophonist, and he was with Dizzy Gillespie's big band and with the small group. And there's a lot of recordings with him on them. He was with Dennis.
There's two of the more popular younger players in New York is a piano player named Matt Shipp, who's got many records out, who they write about a lot, and an alto player named Rob Brown, who's very popular in a certain domain.
Okay.
And they used to come down from New York.
Okay.
When I was studying with Dennis, when I was in my middle teen years, I remember going in one day and I'm sitting in the little waiting room and I hear 2 guitarists in the other room taking lessons. I mean, they're really playing. I'm thinking, oh my goodness, I have to go in there and play like a tremolo exercise, a scale. And so they get done and they come walking out. And the 2 players were John Collins and Harry Polk. And John was one of my favorites. I just looked up, I said, "That's John Collins." And he was with Nat King Cole, I think, at the time. And Harry Polk was with Chico Hamilton. And Dennis introduced, he says, "Well, this is Joseph Federico, this is my student." And then John Collins said, "You're really fortunate." He goes, "I have to come in from Los Angeles to take lessons. At least you can just take like the bus and the trolley or whatever it is."
Yeah.
So they were there when I was there.
Now, we're talking about jazz players. When I was with Dennis, I remember John Lennon's pianist came down, and I think his name was Bobby Little, but I forget, during John's very last...
George Small.
That's it. Little. Okay. Close, okay. Yeah, we're coming from New York, and then John had gotten shot shortly after that. Yeah, just amazing.
And of course, Pat Martino.
Pat
Speaking
Martino.
of guitar players, Pat also studied with
Right,
Dennis.
absolutely, right. I remember Pat telling me on this very show that when he was with Dennis, he looked at him as an artist. He went to him to learn how to be an artist. And is that why most people went to Dennis, just the individuality of it all? More so, as you said, Craig, it wasn't a method, right?
No, it was completely unique. I mean, one of the things about, if you're talking about the teaching method, one of the things that I found incredible about it is, for example, there was some interval that I couldn't hear accurately, and I was playing it out of tune. And I was in the process of playing one of those A1, B1, C1 lessons through the keys, and I knew I was missing it. I hadn't finished playing, and he was already writing my next lesson, and I looked over his shoulder, and that interval was in every measure. He had heard it instantly. He said, "All right, he has to work on this interval, so I'm going to make sure that he has to keep practicing that interval leap until he can master it." So that was part of, so yes, the lessons were completely unique to you, to whatever your particular strengths and weaknesses might be. That's what you got.
But what was I'm sure we all marveled at the fact, I mean, it was completely unique, but yet his mind was so thoroughly organized.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, he knew his, there was no. I know myself trying. Why I don't teach now is I would go. Students come in, I'd be trying to make stuff up as I go, and it's extremely. After you've been with a good teacher, it's when you're being serious, but. What I was trying to get to is that, I mean, even after years and years and years, he could just sit there and create, and create the lesson, because I would say he was creating the lesson. He wasn't pulling out a book. He could create the lesson that was completely in sequence with the last lesson you did, completely led to the next lesson you did. Didn't have to do with the last person or the last 10 people's lessons he wrote out. And he had his, it was creative and an artistic process, but yet so systematically, I mean, both sides of his brain were, thorough, as well as his heart, of course, was so thoroughly developed that it was unbelievable. And I've never seen anybody, could function in that way.
Yeah. Hey, Fred, what was he like as a person outside of a lesson?
Well, if you didn't know him very well, he could appear rather hard to reach, rather distant maybe, or not a friend. I don't want to say not friendly, but rather serious, let's say. However, he had a wonderful sense of humor and often looked at things in an extremely comical way, as most things are. And I think in getting together with all my friends here today and recalling so many instances, there was definitely an element of humor and commentary about things all the time at the studio. And it was kind of like that it's better to laugh than cry type of humor. And his insight, he had a unique insight to everything around him and his observations. He had an extremely colorful vocabulary. He was not only a composer of music, but I would say he was a composer of language. Sometimes I would go home and think, what did he really mean? What was he really saying? If you look at his prose, some of the words aren't even in the dictionary. I wonder today, I'm not sure what he was getting at. Yet with the sound and the feel of the words, they seem to impart some kind of meaning, but whether that was what he intended, I don't know.
He was incredible, though. I mean, just to give you an example, he had a way of doing it, and always in his own style with his use of language. I remember vividly going to a lesson and feeling rather smug. I'm really well prepared today. I'm going to rip through this, and he'll be impressed, or whatever I thought. And I played through my keys, and I was finished my lesson, and I was sort of standing there waiting for some sort of reaction from him. And the reaction I got was, pardon the imitation, "Well, Craig, that was a hair's breadth above average." Now, it happened twice. The second time, same thing. I was feeling pretty sure of myself, and he listened, and he looked up at me from his chair, and he said, "Well, Craig, there seems to be marginal reason for optimism."
I remember that one.
That's great.
That's the way he spoke. He would say things to you like that.
And then usually when you did your worst lesson, you felt the most miserable, and then he would give you abundant praise. I'll never forget one time I wrote something like 4 bars, and I could never, I'm not a piano player, and I would just, I don't know how I would even go through the lesson. I would just, and I'll never forget this. And he said to me, and I believed him, he said, "That's better than Stravinsky." And I was, and you go home and say, "Wow, I should keep doing this. I'm gonna keep going with this. This is great." And his heart was so big, and he was so sensitive, maybe too sensitive. He went, he's a very feeling person, but he could feel people's, conditions so profoundly, and he cared. He really cared about people.
Yes, yeah.
Every student, each one of us probably thought, "I'm the one that he really is." every person who went there, he
had
truly gave them, he really had that relationship, and it was real.
Yeah, that's wonderful, wonderful. And Joe, you spent a lot of time with him. Tell me about that.
The thing that was interesting about Dennis, he didn't, you couldn't get much information out of him about his personal life. He wasn't the type of person to tell you where he played, who worked with him, or who worked for him. You really couldn't pull things like that out. Even though I lived with him, and he lived with me, I have the house. But we shared a lot. We talked about a lot of things together, musical and personal, and we had other common interests. But he wasn't the type of person that would open up too much on his personal life. If you ask him, well, where did you play this or where did you do that? He was usually a little evasive on that. He didn't like to go into too much where he'd been, where he'd gone, what he had done. But he was an interesting individual to speak with. Something I just wanted to mention, it's a little off the line, but it is a shame that he never got the recognition he should have received. I mean, in the Philadelphia area, I mean, even when he was alive, I mean, he still had to go to New York to do the workshops and things. And no one would do the things down here. He should have been doing concerts with those. Why Philadelphia never took advantage of what he could have offered is beyond me.
But I don't think he cared, did he, about
Well,
that?
I think he realized that it would be such an uphill fight. I think knowing Dennis's personality, he wasn't the type that would knock on doors and call back and call back. He wasn't that type of person. If somebody else did it for him, he would go along with that. But it's a shame for all of the musicians he produced, for all the things that he did. Like I said, he had a workshop in Philadelphia. There should have been concerts. His brother Adolph was a little more of a door knocker. I mean, he would go out and work, and he did things in Philadelphia, but he had the same problem. I mean, when he was in New York, he was flourishing, but when he had a place in New York, he had an orchestra there. In Philadelphia, it was like pulling teeth to try and get some of these things accomplished. So it's a shame that down here, neither Dennis or his brother Adolph were appreciated as much as they should have been.
Now, they were natives of Philadelphia, born in Philadelphia?
Yes.
Yeah, so Dennis stayed and Adolph ended up moving up
Well,
there.
Dennis was in Philadelphia, then he
Dennis
went to
stayed
the
in
West Coast, then he moved back. Adolph lived here, and then he had a studio in New York. I mean, he always seemed to be going back and forth, but I think you might say Philadelphia was his residence. And before he died, I know he was doing teaching there, and he was ready to, he was going to be moving in with his sisters, which he passed away, and then eventually Dennis did after so many years. And, but they are native Philadelphians.
And how old was Dennis when he passed away?
Past 80?
About
87.
I think he was 79.
No, I think
He
he was
looked
87.
remarkable. I mean,
It was 87.
Yeah.
I think it was 87. I think he was born in 1913.
Wow.
Okay.
But I remember it was like a day or two after.
It didn't
his
say
80
that on, you know, I don't think he said that, but I believe you.
Yeah, it's about 87.
Yeah, he was amazingly, he never looked his age. I mean, there's if they decide to include it, there's a photograph that I brought today, which was taken within the last couple of years of his life at the studio at 16th and Spruce, which was one of the last places where he taught. And that shows you what he looked like at age 80
Right.
something, you know.
Which is most people's 60, probably.
Bob, you know, there was a quality or an aspect about him, since we're talking about times and dates, and it goes hand in hand with, I think, his general concept or feeling about music and art. He didn't fit into